Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Smart Human Podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with Jeanne Lenzer, who is an award-winning independent medical investigative journalist and author, and she has explored over her decades of work the intersection of money and medicine. Today, we're talking about medical devices, their usage in the United States, regulation, pitfalls, how to navigate the medical device landscape, and so much more. So stay tuned. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Smart Human Podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with Jeanne Lenzer, who is an award-winning independent medical investigative journalist and author whose hard-hitting investigations and analyses have appeared in medical journals such as the British Medical Journal and the Journal of Family Practice, and in outlets such as the New York Times, Washington Post, Smithsonian Magazine, The Atlantic. She has written the book The Danger Within Us, America's Untested, Unregulated Medical Device Industry, and One Man's Battle to Survive It, which explores themes that have been in the heart of Lenzer's work for over 3 decades, the intersection of money and medicine. And we'll get into all of this, but I wanted to thank Jeanne for being here and, really excited to speak to you.
No, thank you so much. Nice opportunity to be here. Thank you.
Well, I have really loved your work from the time when your book became published. I have really just wanted to speak to you in detail beyond what is so beautifully written in your book. Tell us a little bit about yourself just to get started. You're seasoned investigative reporter. You have had a remarkable career. How did you get here?
Well, I started out actually in medicine as a PA, a physician associate, and I, like a lot of clinical providers, just became frustrated with seeing the difference between the claims that modern medicine makes and what we actually saw in our patients. And that was maybe part of it, but the bigger part of it came when I first learned about the class trial, which showed that there's this remarkable illusion that we were helping people. And the class trial was about drugs, a certain type of drug that we give to people who might have irregular heart rhythms during a heart attack. And we all thought we were saving lives with these drugs. So we automatically gave the drugs. And it was remarkable because I can never forget one patient in particular and I opened my preface, I think, in my book about this, where this firefighter came in and he was sweating and he was having crushing chest pain and he was terrified. And I ordered the medicine, the nurse gave it, and all these abnormal beats that he had just vanished. They went away. And these are really warning signs, those kinds of beats, that they can be thrown into a deadly rhythm within seconds and die. And so I felt like I was saving lives until I read the study that somebody actually had the guts to do the right thing. It had never been tested for outcomes. It only looked at, did we get rid of the bad heartbeats? It didn't look at, well, did people live any longer? And in fact, not only didn't they live any longer, they were actually 3.6 times as likely to die if we gave the drug. And so that stopped. That had been a recommendation of the American Heart Association that all patients got it. So all doctors around the country prescribed it. And that stopped because of that study. But that kind of illusion exists across medicine, across both drugs and medical devices, as I found out with this book.
And there's a name for what you call this, right?
Yeah. I call it cure as cause, where we get, Dr. Jerome Hoffman, who's emeritus professor of medicine at UCLA, has been my mentor for several decades. And one of the things he says is that you can easily overshoot what you're trying to fix. So say you're trying to, as with the device that I talk about in the article in my book, where this guy came to me because of problems he was having with his device, it is something that's supposed to decrease seizures, but instead of just decreasing seizures, it can actually overshoot and increase seizures. Just as this drug was supposed to reduce deaths from a deadly rhythm, it actually created a new problem and increased deaths because of a peculiarity about the type of rhythm they would go into. And so that exists across all you can find that in gynecology and orthopedics and psychiatry. Every single sort of specialty has these kind of overshoots.
Yeah, and you basically and get into beautifully with all of your exhaustive research on a variety of medical devices and medications. But you get into this idea that some of the complications from these medications and devices are blamed on the underlying condition as opposed to the actual treatment that was employed for that moment.
Absolutely. Okay. I'm so glad you said it for me, because that is the most important part. Is that it is an illusion. It's so seductive. I mean, I was totally seduced by the fact that I saw those bad heart rhythms disappear, and I was convinced I was saving lives. It's important to realize that blaming deaths, and that's what we thought. If somebody came in with a heart attack and, you can't save everybody. I gave the drug and the heartbeats disappeared, but the patient died anyway. Well, it was because they were going to die anyway. And that's unfortunately what happens way too often.
In that particular case, it was lidocaine that was being pushed. Is that correct?
Yes. If it is, lidocaine is very effective if you already have a certain type of rhythm that you need to treat, but used prophylactically. And that's another big illusion in medicine, is that catch it early, do something before the problem starts, is actually one of the worst sort of conceptions we have, because treating things before they're a problem, I mean, you can sort of, I liken it to having a little fire in a trash receptacle in your room. You have a tiny little metal container and there's a little tiny fire in it, and you call the fire department and they come out and blast their hoses at your house and destroy everything, when all you needed to do is take a little glass of water or wait for it to extinguish itself. Now, had it caught on to the drapes and was threatening to spread to your bookcase, at that point you might want to intervene. And unfortunately, we have this illusion that if you see the tiniest hint of anything, let's intervene. And it's not a good idea in a lot of cases. Some cases, yes, but most cases, no.
Yeah. And so this interesting beginning to your curiosity kind of moved you through lots of different topics. How did you end up really honing in on medical devices? Tell us a little bit about that. And also, what is a medical device? Give us an idea about sort of that general description.
Yeah. So how I got started was with that example of the patient that I saw and then the subsequent study. And this mentor I had, he told me about a drug that was being given for stroke. And there was a problem with how it was recommended by the Heart Association. And it turned out that there had been a rumor in the physician emergency medicine mill that, that the company had basically bought off the American Heart Association to get the approval for their drug. And I'll never forget, a doctor wrote back and said, I checked into this rumor. It's just, common myth. It's not true. They didn't get money. And I thought, this sounds like it might be possible. So I checked in with the American Heart Association, and they wouldn't disclose their advisors and what money they got. But I dug it up, and it turned out they had gotten $11 million from the drug maker and then made this positive recommendation, which was not a recommendation made in Europe, where they didn't have the same kind of financial pressures. And that led me to write my first article, my first investigative article. And that, in turn, that was published worldwide. So I landed up having a lot of people, mostly doctors, but sometimes patients, contact me and say, have I got a story for you? And that's what happened with medical devices. And a lot of times people call me with things that are either legitimate, but I can't look into it because I'm already swamped, or this sort of, tinfoil hat kind of things. But in this case, this one fellow contacted me, and he became the sort of focus of my book. And also, I'm blanking on his name, Dennis Fagan. So Dennis Fagan was a firefighter and a paramedic. And he said that he had been given this device called a vagus nerve stimulator that's used to treat seizures. And he said this damn device just about killed me. And so I looked into it. I asked him for all his medical records and looked through them. And I was shocked. I saw something I'd never seen before in my life. And I'd spent 20 years in and out of working in emergency rooms or family practice. And his electrocardiogram every 3 minutes on the dot, he went into complete asystole. That's a flat line. He just flatlined every 3 minutes. And it lasted so long that he would pass out. And it was really shocking. His story is, and when I got his medical records, it was pretty tragic. His family had come to visit him one day, and he didn't answer the door. They finally went and got their own key, went into the house, and they called for him. And he came stumbling out of his room, sort of sat down on a chair, and then fell down. And when he sort of came to a few minutes later, he wiggled himself over to the wall, sitting on the floor, legs splayed. Jeans are wet with urine, and he'd pass out again. And then he came back to, and his parents figured, well, this is another seizure because he has known seizure disorder. And he had another 8 of those episodes while they were there waiting for the paramedics to arrive. Paramedics took one look at him and said, guy's seizing, and they gave him anti-seizure medicine, which did absolutely nothing. He just kept passing out. And that's when they finally got him to the ER, and the doctor saw that, he was having asystole. The device was literally killing him every 3 minutes. Lord knows what that did to his brain, that, oxygen deprivation.
And that was implanted. He had an implantable vagus.
Yes, I'm sorry. So this is a device that got implanted under the collarbone, a little sort of matchbook size thing. And then they run a wire, they tunnel it up through the neck, and they wrap it around the vagus nerve with this strange explanation that somehow that's going to reduce seizures. The studies I've looked at, I'm not at all convinced that they reduce seizures. And in fact, there's plenty to show that it may just increase deaths. But the illusion is just like the illusion with the drug I talked about with the abnormal heart rhythms. And I'll give you an example. I was still practicing in family practice at one point, and I saw a number of patients who had these vagus nerve stimulators. And I remember asking the aides who came in with these patients, because these patients were institutionalized, a number of them, they had multiple neurologic problems. And the type of seizure that this is supposed to treat is it's called partial complex seizures. So these aren't necessarily ones where patients have grand mal seizures and they shake. Right. It's just they may seem fuzzy for a few minutes, or they may stutter and repeat something several times. Right. And so and usually they only last 1 to 3 minutes. And I'll never forget, I asked that, so they have this, I'll have to back up. They have a magnet that they can use, the assistants or the patient themselves, if they can do it. And if they want to activate the device, instead of having it fire every 3 minutes, they can put the magnet on it and make it fire instantly. So I remember asking one of the aides, well, how long does it take you to sort of, you're sitting there, you're watching the patient, you notice that they seem to be out of it or they're stuttering or something. How long does it take you to get the magnet, go over to the patient, put it on? And they say, well, maybe I didn't notice it for the first 30 seconds and maybe another minute for me to get the magnet and go over there to the patient. And then maybe it's over within 30 seconds to a minute. Well, that all adds up to the 3 minutes it was going to go away anyway. We don't really know what these things are doing. We do know one thing. There are quite a few deaths with this device. And in fact, the one study I could find where they actually looked at deaths instead of just looking at seizures, again, like that drug, you want to look at what we call a surrogate endpoint. You look at this thing you can measure rather than what it's really doing to the patient. And the one I could find was on pediatrics, because a lot of children, have seizures. Right. And the death rate was higher in the kids. In fact, if I remember right, there were no deaths in the kids who were treated medically, and there were only deaths in the kids who got the vagus nerve stimulant. That isn't to say that kids don't die from seizures. There's a real reason to want to treat folks with seizures, because they can die. But we need to know that that's really doing more good than harm.
So all of this kind of led to your, asking questions, trying to find deeper answers, looking for the data, which kind of made you look at other aspects of data. Who's paying for data? Where's that money coming from? How's it getting approved? But again, when we think about medical devices, because we're going to get into that, medical devices include what? Lots of different things, right? So by definition, I even was just sitting there, preparing for this this interview and I was thinking about all the different types of devices that we may not even think of as medical.
Yeah.
I mean, we think of breast implants and pacemakers and prosthetic joints. Those are very obvious, very common. But a tongue depressor?
Yeah. So there's classes of devices. And the first class 1 devices are considered very low risk. And they would be things like tongue depressors, bandages, the stretcher that you lie on. Stretchers can fall and trap you. Tongue depressors can break and you swallow a piece of it.
Right.
But they're so low risk that they're class 1 and you don't require clinical trials to figure out if they're safe to go on the market. I mean, you may want to know that the tongue depressor doesn't have heavy metal in it or things like that. Those things are real, but generally low risk. Class 2 are intermediate risk devices, and some of them can be implantable. So class 1 by definition is not implantable. But class 2, they used to have a lot of orthopedic implants that were considered class 2. Some of those have been moved to class 3 now, but it would be things like IV pumps that make your intravenous fluids flow in at the correct rate. Again, if it doesn't flow at the correct rate, you could die from an overdose of a drug or not get enough of a drug. And class 3 are the highest risk devices. Those are devices like deep brain stimulators, pacemakers, defibrillators, implanted defibrillators, those kinds of things.
IUDs? Would an IUD be in that category?
I think IUDs are in category 2. I think they're class 2.
Interesting. I'm actually even curious about how they get, once they're in the body, how do they get designated by risk as to 2 or 3? Is that really kind of where they're at in terms of actual risk?
Yeah, it's definitely IUDs can cause a risk. You can have perforations, you can get sepsis, but those are relatively low rate occurrences usually. So that's why I think it might be class 2, but people would have to check that.
Yeah. And bovine cartilage and fake cement bone.
Oh, let me tell you a story about that. Okay. So the bovine cartilage, I want to get to this. So there was a device called Menaflex, and this was a knee replacement. And not a knee replacement, it was for the cartilage in the knee to spare the joint, like a sponge between the joints, sort of. And I believe it was 3 times or 4 times, I can't remember which, where the FDA researchers, the FDA, not advisors because that's external, FDA's own people themselves, they're researchers who are tasked with deciding whether a device is safe and effective, said to the FDA, do not approve this device. Don't approve it. It's dangerous. It causes harm in something like 40% of patients. It's not good. It doesn't work. So don't approve it. And they turned it down 3 times. Finally, the company got so pissed off that what they did is they went to the managers. And this is where the problem arises. And I should talk about that a little bit, why it's at the managerial level. But they went to the managers and the managers overruled them each time. And finally, what they did is they created a new advisory committee to decide whether the device should go on the market. And who did they put on the supposedly independent external advisory committee? They put the CEO of the manufacturer of Menaflex on the advisory committee. I mean, this is just judge your own.
But it goes back to the whole the whole reason why I'm so intrigued with this topic. And I think I chased you down for a year. I said I courted you for a year after reading your book. I remember pulling over on the side of the road. I think it was 2017. You were doing an NPR, discussion. And I remember exactly pulling over to listen to your discussion so I wouldn't get into a car accident because what you were saying about the lack of regulation. Okay. What drugs require to go to market through the FDA approval system versus what medical devices require. That statement alone just blew my mind.
Yeah.
So can you share that very simple information and then go into sort of how many people have medical devices and are affected by that particular kind of regulation? And you yourself are a recipient of.
Yes, I mean, this is true.
I've got. So I like you to wait.
Lenses.
Exactly. So I love knowing
glasses
that.
Devices.
And your
And
husband had a pacemaker, I think you were very open about. So
Yes.
I love that you're able to say there are good and there's bad, but this is
I'm
something
super
that's
grateful
pretty
for
bad.
cataract lenses. There are devices that are wonderful, but what's tragic is that we have trouble telling the difference between what is wonderful and what is flying under the radar and dangerous. And that's because the testing is so bad. Now, we compare it to drugs, but that's a problem. I'm doing a major project right now, investigation for the last 2 years on FDA's approval of drugs. And it is so bad. But devices, if it's even possible to say, are even worse. And there's the leader of the one major research assessment organization, and she said, about lowering the scientific bar at the FDA, and she said it's impossible to lower it any lower. It's already in the dirt. So here's the deal. With a drug, you're supposed to, this is not what happens, but you're supposed to have 2 randomized controlled trials. Each aspect of that's really important. A control is that you have a comparison group. I mean, too often we say, 40% of people got better with this drug. Well, 46% got better with no drugs, but they didn't test it. They didn't test it against a comparator. They didn't test it against placebo. So having a comparison group, being blinded so that you don't know and you don't have a biasing effect from that. And replication is huge. They're finding out now that attempts to repeat these studies, most often they can't replicate them. So we don't really know with a lot of things. I mean, you'll always replicate insulin for diabetes. You'll always replicate certain beta agonists for asthma. I mean, there's certain things that really do work, and we know it because it's dramatic. And we don't even have to test it. It's so dramatic, like insulin. But if you do test it and things that you're not totally sure, you can repeat it and you'll always find that. Unfortunately, now what we're seeing a lot of drugs, well, let me get away from that and go back to devices. So the idea is that class 3 devices are the one, because they're so high risk, that they should be subjected to some sort of clinical trial. But that is not what happens. So there was a study done about the highest risk cardiac implantable devices, and they found that only 5% had actually been tested in clinical trials.
In humans, not just
Humans,
animals.
right.
You're just saying humans.
Yeah.
Before it went to market.
Yeah.
And that's the same for all devices, right? Because they not only require less randomized, double-blinded, well-done studies, the kind that really show that there's no bias between the doctors that are evaluating those patients.
Right.
Doctors don't know the patients that got the device or not, or drug or not. Okay,
and
that
they've
makes
got
it
a comparator.
blinded, so they can't bias their reactions or the results. But you're saying that devices require even far less.
Far less.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's this additional problem where they have what they call supplemental approvals. And somebody described this. We used to call it whisper down the lane when I was a kid. I think other people call it telephone, where you say one thing to one person, the next person repeats it. By the time it gets to the end of the line, there's no correlation with what originally said. Well, that's what happens with devices, where they apply for these supplements. And that happened with one deadly device where they said, we've got a pacemaker, and all we're going to do is replace the wire. So that's all, The only problem was the wires broke, and it killed a number of people. I mean, they would shock them. This was another thing that happened with the vagus nerve stimulator because of that wire. And there's some horrific tales of people. There's one woman before she died, and she kept screaming every time the thing fired, help me, help me. It was just shocking the wits out of her because something went wrong with a wire with the electricity. Which brings me to another point, that there are some significant, substantial differences between devices and drugs that people should think about before they get them. That is, with a drug, you can just stop it if it's causing side effects or harms. The device, that's not always the case. And in fact, with a number of pacemakers and vagus nerve stimulators, removal of the device actually was dangerous. And so people sort of had this sort of Damocles hanging over them, like with that pacemaker I was talking about with the wire. Yeah. They got the news, your wire may fragment, it may shock you, and it's going to feel god awful, or it may kill you. What do you want to do? But if we take it out, it may also kill you. So it's a rock and a hard place. You want to think hard before you get devices if they're not necessary. When they're necessary, usually it's because the situation is so bad that you're better off taking a risk. But if you're not, I mean, we're talking about back pain. Watch out.
Yeah. And that's the whole risk benefit ratio for everything, whether you step off the curb and walk into the street. But here we're talking about materials and, inventions that are just not really even, required for, to have testing at any significant amount before they go into humans. And what I think we're alluding to is when I was watching, and we'll get into this, the Netflix
Bleeding Edge
documentary, which was remarkable. You were on it, and so many people, so many interesting people, but really weighty people also, along with yourself, from major academic institutions weighing in on the medical device industry, is that when they reapply, say, for instance, a hip replacement gets modified, it can be applied for by that new company for the new design with even less, testing than the previous model, even if they only adjust a very small component of that design.
I have got to give you,
you see like this beautiful and scary tree of, hip replacements that have been replacing previous versions that had trouble, and yet each of the new versions don't have required testing. So that just image from that documentary, The Bleeding Edge, which we'll have on our, our page, was just so critically important to understanding some of this process,
Well, the most Kafkaesque thing I ran into about this issue of telephone and making these subtle changes was vaginal mesh that can also be used in hernias. So they have these mesh that, can grate through your tissue like a cheese grater, it just embeds itself in people sometimes, and you can't get it out if it's causing problems. And some people, it was causing intensive bleeding and pain. And
they're put in just to let the audience know, they're put in for women who say bladder drops. You've had multiple children, and you're just uncomfortable, or you have some incontinence, or something that has to do with the bladder and its location. And so mesh, which it sounds like what it is that plastic type of, is placed underneath to lift up the bladder and some other components of the pelvic region. Problem is that it embeds into the tissue, and then you can't kind of get it out. But anyway.
Yeah. So there was this mesh that was implanted that was it turned out to cause a lot of these problems. And it had been approved on the basis of, there had been another mesh before that. And that mesh had already been removed from the market because it was dangerous. So I called up the FDA and I said, why did you approve this mesh to go on the market based on a prior mesh that you knew had already been removed because it was dangerous? And they said, we don't check how well it worked. We only check that it existed. It existed. So no matter how much damage it caused, we'll put another one on the market. I mean, things are so crazy. I've been very frustrated by the what I call trade secret deaths. And I can't get into that now, but if people want to read about it, they'll go to my website and see there's a story I tell about it. And just the other day in JAMA, or maybe a month or two ago in JAMA, they talked about the fact that the FDA openly acknowledges that it protects trade secrets, including clinical outcomes, rather than protect the public health. And it literally says that, even if it comes to it where it would be important for the public health, we will protect the trade secrets. This is just, I'm fighting it right now on a specific drug, and the devices is the same thing. You can't get certain information that's important for the public health. Our FDA is not doing what it should be.
It's remarkable. The more I learned, the more I had to learn more. As a rheumatologist, we're starting to learn more about vagal nerve stimulators. Now, mind you, they may have for rheumatoid
What's the deal with
So there's trying to do now external versus internal. I mean, it's got moving parts. I don't want to comment because I haven't done the research specifically. I want to make sure I get the right data. And of course, like yourself, I'm going to be thinking about all of the risks when you put anything on, in, or around the body. But I find it really, when I talk to young patients about IUDs and things that, in common patients who don't necessarily have to have them for emergency reasons, that's the discussion of the risk-benefit ratio. Are there alternatives that may be safer? Are there things that are outside of the body as opposed to implantable? So it's just something to think about because like with IUDs, your body is intentionally making an inflammatory response to remove a fetus that implants, right?
Yeah.
It's like the Assure issue that was covered in the documentary also is about women who didn't want to have any more children. They were metal coils that were put into the fallopian tubes that were creating an inflammatory response to
purposely to shut them down.
To shut so it's utilizing the body's unique immune system for the use of the, but then we think it doesn't have any outskirts outside of that particular issue. So it's just all very, interesting. Tell us a little bit about how many people in the U.S. have medical devices. Give us some stats. Give us some data.
We thought it was roughly 1 in 10 because you have to include silly things like, ear tubes and lens implants for cataracts. So, but I shouldn't say that's silly. I mean, some people lose their vision altogether, but when you include all the implantable things, it may be as high. It looks like it's as high as 1 in 10 people.
Yeah, 1 in 10 people, and that covers the whole gamut of implantable
from the minor stuff like the ear tubes right up to deep brain stimulators and
it's all
intraventricular assist devices to keep people's hearts pumping when they're not pumping anymore or to assist it.
And so given that, and the fact is, where's the market going moving forward since there's really no guardrails, there's no regulatory process? I mean, where are we in your estimation, given now your book is
getting worse?
Yeah, I was going to say you covered a few years ago, but it's still so relevant to today. I mean, nothing's changed really.
It's getting worse for 2 reasons. One is that they are making the devices more complex now so that there's I'm forgetting the name of it. There's a device that they were putting in the cervical spine for people with cervical spine disease. And they're combining a metal product, a hardware product, with what is basically a drug. So they have bone stimulator that goes in with the device itself. So these are complex things. They're not just drugs and they're not just devices. They're both. And those caused a number of deaths because the bone would grow too much in the neck and impinge on their airway. And that's what caused the deaths in some people. The other reason is that deregulation has led to money running everything. Profiteering is a super problem. And before I talked to you today, I decided, I haven't even thought about devices in 5 years since my book was published. I've move on to the next thing. So I had to sort of scroll back to remember some stuff. So I decided to look at what's happened with vagus nerve stimulators since I last reported on it. And I just went to the database. So anybody who wants to look up devices, you can go to what's called the Morgue database, MAUDE. And that's where you can look up side effects or complications of various devices. So I looked at the vagus nerve stimulator. Let me see. I think I typed it out. What I found was, here it is. Yeah. So there were more deaths in the interim. And we know that death reporting in the databases and FDA's databases is voluntary. And so the estimates that have actually run some studies show that only 1 in 10 get reported. You're lucky if it's that. But here I decided, I'm going to look at the narrative on one. I'm not just going to look at the numbers. I'm going to look at the narrative. So I took first one. What do I find? Now, just to prepare people for what I'm going to say, this is obviously either a highly trained tech who's in the OR with the doctors, a doctor who implants this stuff and is annoyed with other doctors implanting it, or it's one of the med tech sales reps because there's too much knowledge involved. But what they say is understandable. They write, the pin is often slipping out of the generator of the VNS device, and the company makes the VNS that makes it is covering it up. Reimbursement of the pin requires extra surgery. The company doesn't communicate the potential for radiofrequency field burns. Now, there was one patient who went into the MRI, came out freaking because people need to run MRI and those metal wires, and it burned right through her neck. So this is, they're noticing two problems here, the pin coming out, not radio frequency. And then they go on to say, this device is being used off-label by salespeople and neurosurgeons in the settings just after implantation and set at a high level, causing the potential for asystole. That's what I talked about with Dennis Fagan, flatlining, stopping the heart. And in some cases, patient deaths as a result. And he said, or he or she, whoever's writing this says, before I get to that part, it says, salespeople show up unwelcome with scrubs on as if they are healthcare providers to sell this product in the examination rooms, utilizing wrong data in front of patients and physicians. And they end by saying, I'm going to be disclosing this to the press by the end of 2024. And I didn't disclose it to me. So if you're out there, person, I want to know about this because I'll report on it.
Yeah. So here you have, and I remember this from, medical training and residency, when we were in the OR, in the OR training, there were medical device company reps. And, you could argue they were well-trained or they were trained from the company and they were extensions of, maybe the research that was done, and they were aiding the physician in doing the procedure correctly. So there's that argument.
Right.
But there's, and if it's already, the horse has left the stable and it's already to market, then we would want as much training as possible in that OR, right? You could argue that.
Yes.
I think the opposite argument is what you're making is that, you can have as much what you think highly trained people, but if the apparatus itself has problems, you're out of luck.
Yeah.
That's
where you need to separate the roles. And that's what we keep arguing about. I had one doctor who, was upset with me because I talked about their financial conflicts. And I said, look, we need people like you. You develop drugs, you test them. That's really important. That's great. But we need separate people to assess it. And so what happens more typically is the training doctors get is from the med rep instead of from independent researchers. Right. So if they select a device based on good knowledge and independent research, fine. Then it's great to have the med rep from that company in the OR because they do know the details of that device. They can help with the implantation. It's really two different roles.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And going back, my head keeps ticking. We don't require animal studies. We don't require, am I correct on this? So which kinds of studies are actually required as far as you know?
So,
if they're not requiring what drugs require, what are they requiring? And who are on that board to assess that?
Well, most of the time, these things don't go to an advisory committee, neither drugs nor devices. They only do when they think there's going to be a controversy about something, when, maybe the measure is too close and they're not sure and they want external advisors or for political reasons sometimes. But with the medical devices, a lot of times they're just measuring the device itself. So, for example, I think, let's see, I had here 50. Yeah, here it is, a study of 50 devices for which the manufacturers did provide data to the FDA. Because sometimes they don't provide any data. They just say, this is a class 2, I don't need to, None of those 50 devices gave studies of how the devices functioned inside the patient after they were implanted. Instead, what they submitted were data on the materials that were used or how the device operated in bench testing outside of a person's body.
So we're not even talking in humans who they're going to be used for.
Yeah, and I saw this with orthopedic devices. I went to something called the device Morgue. And this is, I can't remember the university. I want to say Cornell, but I don't think it was Cornell. There's a university that has what they call a device morgue. And a lot of people from around the country, probably even the world, send devices to them that have been explanted, taken out of people, either because of failure or the person died, whatever. And then they examine the devices to see what went wrong. But they showed me that this is the kind of testing that was done before they got approval. So with a hip implant, they simply, had a machine that would ratchet the hip like this over and over and over to see how it wore. But what that didn't tell you is what we found with one of the orthopedists I talk about who got a hip implant himself. And and he got cobalt poisoning because there was cobalt in the metal that leached out. And you don't know these things until it's in a human being. And that's why we need human testing on these things.
Yeah.
They don't function just like they do outside. So it's bench testing.
Yeah.
For a
In
lot
terms
of devices.
that gentleman who was on the documentary, who was an orthopedic surgeon who had his own hip replaced and was really kind of took it for granted what he was getting, and then realized that he had all sorts of, there was all these neurological, and people should really, really watch this documentary, because I thought it should be required, by the way, required watching for medical students and also patients considering, and it's not to say that people who are sitting there listening to this conversation should go and try to rip out any kind of medical devices that they're in their bodies. I mean, this is not
a number of them, be grateful for them.
Right.
But a few.
Yeah. I mean, I would say to listeners that this is not about, flipping out, freaking out, alarmist. This is about really taking information that you've collected, investigated, really strong information from other major groups in the medical institution, within the institution, researchers, heads of departments in major university research labs, and really making smart decisions moving forward. And perhaps, and thinking about that. But that gentleman who was the orthopedic surgeon, it was interesting because a few years ago, I got one of my throwaway rheumatology journals. We call them throwaway because it's like they're really quick reads and you throw them away after you get kind of a good title and read some basic research that comes in, and then you dive in deeper if you choose to. But they're great. They're great throwaways. But anyway, I saw this headline about cobalt in hip replacements. I mean, this is a while ago. And I couldn't understand it. And really what it comes down to is that people should understand if they have metal allergies, they should know what that contraption is made out of. Usually, what type of metal. They could have an allergy. They could have, So it was just so fascinating that here you had an insider orthopedic surgeon giving this story and all of the side effects he experienced before really seeing that connection.
Yeah. Cause vision loss, neurological problems. One of the health tragically funny stories about this was a woman, and this was reported. So a lot of the work that I do in my book is citation to New England Journal, JAMA, BMJ,
I'm going to hold it up
over
just
and over.
because I want people to see this book. I think
Thank
it's
you.
incredibly valid and go ahead. Sorry.
A million citations in that. But one of the interesting stories was a woman who, a relatively young woman who developed heart failure, and she had no reason to develop heart failure. She didn't have high blood pressure. She didn't have diabetes. She didn't have any autoimmune disease. So they couldn't figure out why she had such bad heart failure, and they put her on drugs. That didn't do it. And then eventually they have to put a pacemaker in. That didn't do it. And finally her heart failed so badly that they had to put her on a pump device to keep her heart going. And that's only maximum. You're lucky if you get a month to a year on that before you die. And so, eventually they just gave her a heart transplant. And then the new heart started to fail. And all of a sudden, a doctor remembered a segment on the, television show House. And that guy, what's the name of I guess his name is House, right?
Yeah,
Dr.
House. Yeah.
Dr. House or something.
I don't know the actor's name off the top of my head, but go ahead.
Yeah. And he did a segment about cobalt hip implants. And this doctor remembered that show and said, aha, maybe this is why her new heart is failing. And he found out she had 2 hip implants. He did cobalt levels on her. They were sky high. Yeah. They took out both hip implants, replaced them. Her cobalt levels came down and her heart started working again. But she had to go through all that damage.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
And can you never know too much about what's being implanted? I mean, we'll get to I wrote down some of the things that, were listed even at the back of the documentary, but, let's get back into the documentary. How did you get involved with that? Because it seems to really highlight your work. And, tell me a little bit, who reached out to you and how did you get involved in that?
I'm not sure I remember this exactly right. So if the filmmakers happen to ever see this, just tell me if I got it wrong. But as I recall, they just called me up because they knew I'd written about medical devices because my book wasn't out. It hadn't been published at the time. I remember that much.
Yeah.
I think it wasn't. But they contacted me. I didn't contact them.
That's interesting. Yeah. And it's called The Bleeding Edge on Netflix. So I'm just going to, let people know about that. And it's accessible. So they can.
Oh, John Oliver also did a segment on it and contacted me as well. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. You mentioned that. So let me get into some more questions to pick your brain. The medical industrial complex. Okay. We all have ideas of what that means, but you tell us, what does that mean to you, having done all this research and looked into all of these botched companies with their poor testing required and all that stuff? I mean, again, we have good stuff out there too, but
Yes.
I want to evenly balance the fact that a lot of people are doing quite well from some of their stuff that they've received, in terms of implantable medical devices and such. But tell us what you consider the medical industrial complex, having really seen what you've seen.
So think back to the CEO I mentioned who got onto the panel, the advisory panel for Menaflex. How does that happen? Well, back in, I'm going to forget the year. This is in my book, and I'm not even positive it was Nixon versus Reagan. I think it was Nixon. It was Nixon, 1968, I think. Changed the position of FDA commissioner from being a civil servant to being a political appointee. Before then, all FDA commissioners were civil employees. And why does that make a huge difference? It's not just because you're under the political thumb of whoever's president at the time. It's because civil servants are not allowed to get money from the very industry it's supposed to regulate.
Makes sense.
But since that change was made so that they're a political appointee and come from outside, not virtually, 9 out of the 10 commissioners have come from industry. They are deep in bed with industry. So they have a different perspective, a different mindset. And that's how you get people overruling your own researchers to say, no, this isn't safe. Don't approve it. So what did the FDA...
It's like the fox manning the hen house, It's
Absolutely.
Basically, how can you be unbiased when and there's other people that come from the government go right into the drug industry and vice versa now.
Yeah.
I mean, recently even as well.
So what did the FDA do when it found out that, these scientists, the FDA scientists who are rejecting over and over, not just that device, but multiple other devices? There was a chest CT device that was delivering something like more than 100 chest x-rays at once with one. And they were saying, this is not safe. It wasn't a chest CT. I think it was for CT colonography. Ignore me.
Right. And increase the risk. And this, increase the risk for abdominal cancers because, and the argument was from the head gastroenterologist, I think at Hopkins, or, it was just a really big concern who was also on the FDA panel for the research was that it's so high that we should at least have a warning label so that doctors would at least be judicious about using this CAT scan for the abdomen. And
so what they typically do is they say, oh, well, this only delivers X much. But what they don't take into account is that people aren't just getting that one. They're getting, 20,000 other. But at any rate, so what happened is these guys, I think there were 12 of them who ended up being 9. I'm not sure, but there were at least 9 internal FDA scientists who had repeatedly said unanimously, don't approve this device, don't approve that device, don't approve this. They finally got so frustrated that they contacted Grassley, who at the time was, I don't know if it's energy and commerce or health, whatever, but he was overseeing misbehavior at FDA. And so they finally contacted him, and then they have contacted Obama because they kept getting overruled. And they were saying, this is dangerous to the public. So what did the FDA do? They harassed the hell out of these 9 doctors. It's called the FDA 9, and there's an article in the New York Times about it. They not only harassed the hell out of them and fired a bunch of them, but before they did that, what they did is they put spyware on those doctors' computers because they wanted to see who they were talking to. And then they charged them with releasing trade secrets, because saying that something is dangerous is giving away a trade secret. This is the solution.
Yeah. I mean, it's basically this idea that, new, innovative, not always better, not always safe, push to market. I mean, I say this about medications with my patients. I like to go from old to new in terms of the medications because I've been around long enough to know some of these drugs have been around as long as I've been in training. So those are the ones that collect the most data. They also collect the most side effect complaints from patients. Pharmaceutical drug companies have to pull that data in and really make it, and manage that. But, the newer stuff that we're we're sold on, newer, bigger,
Yeah.
better, more is not always well tested or
there was a hilarious thing about this one drug that was very expensive in the United States, and it was competing with a much cheaper drug, and that a lot of doctors felt was actually safer. And they had this international meeting where a lot of the European doctors were all saying in Europe, the meeting was in Europe, and they said, we use this other drug because it's older, it's safer, and it's cheaper. And they were just amazed at the U.S. doctors who were all saying, oh, no, you must use this new drug. And one of the doctors made a comment and said, they seem to think that because something is more expensive, it's better. They always latch on to that. And that's a mindset that's not just among the public, it's among doctors. Yeah.
What is the current process for researchers to share that there's a problem? I mean, given what you said about, being the spyware that FDA put, and it was admitted, right? I mean, this was something that was actually
a whole article
admitted.
about it.
This is a big story that a lot of people didn't know about, I guess, unless you read the New York
Almost no
Times.
one knows about it.
Yeah.
Even though it hit the New York Times, I was shocked.
Yeah.
Everybody I talked to, no one knows about it.
Well, the news cycles, it's whatever, sexy and hot at the moment, But I guess the question is, what is the reporting, process for either researchers that really see a problem? Obviously, they're not being listened to as well as they should be. But also capturing that data out in the real world with physicians that use these products. I mean, where is that now in terms, anything better than where we've been?
Well, there are attempts to make it better, but they are so slow as to completely be defeatist. And what kills me is, I always say, look, Walmart can track a head of lettuce within seconds, where it came from, how long it was on the shelf, which shelf it's on, where it went, and how much it cost. Within milliseconds, it has that information on every single item in its store. And yet we don't do that. And so I'm going to tell a story right now that I'm going to have to disguise a little bit because it's current reporting that I haven't yet published. But it's really got me upset. And this is that I'm looking at deaths from a certain item and drug or device. I'm not even going to say. And I ask the company whether they're tracking the number of deaths because they criticized some researchers. They really went after some researchers who reported a problem with deaths from this product. And I said to them, well, do you track the sites that are using this particular product to see what happens? And at first they just tried to use a lot of words to get around me and make it sound like, oh, yes, we do. We track everything and it's all available. And finally, I really got them to have to acknowledge that they don't. They have no protocol for oversight, for surveillance, for whether this product is causing deaths or not. And yet they will criticize anyone. And in fact, in another case with a different item, this was a drug, and I've had a number of doctors call me with this kind of thing, but I'll never forget this one doctor. She reported that her patients were developing congestive heart failure from a diabetes drug. And what happened to her the second she reported it? Oh, her hospital got a phone call from the company threatening to take away the funding that they were giving them for some research or something. And that's the kind of thing that happens. Doctors really get hammered. In fact, another doctor, that was a very famous case, about Synthroid. Oh, yes, a thyroid storm. And she actually, the drug company went to her neighbors trying to make her sound like she was crazy and went through her garbage trying to find any incriminating stuff that she could find. And she was later vindicated and showed to be absolutely correct in her concern that this,
So there's no whistleblower protections is what you're saying.
Well, there are some whistleblowers, and I, highly recommend the Government Accountability Project. I'm not sure they're still around, but there are groups that work with this.
Yeah,
but,
you actually, at the back of this book had wonderful resources for industry independent organizations, publications, and patient advocacy and support groups. And you just, lots of information here. So if someone is concerned who's listening, is not hopefully freaking out. That's not the intention. This is education, not, alarmism, I hope. But the idea is, there are groups out there that you can, share your stories, share your information, certainly with your physician. I will say as a physician who recently had a patient who had a problem with a medication, which I couldn't identify any other cause or attribute any other cause, the amount of paperwork that I had to go through to get this, back to the
Reported.
manufacturer and to report it. And it really had to go back to the manufacturer. I mean, in a busy medical practice, this is what I think, unfortunately,
almost no doctors do what you just did.
It's a shame because
you can't. You've got 5 minutes to see a patient. What are you going to do? I mean, it's unbelievable how
it's a stifling system. And I think, and I did it because I do believe these are the things that need to be heard. But again, the system is not really streamlined in a way that can make really, action out of insult. You know what I mean? So, but I appreciate that you have that because patients can really do a lot on their own. I mean, look at the eShore issue, right? So when that was in the documentary about that, infertility, or not infertility, but the, trying to prevent pregnancy and the coils that were put intentionally for women who wanted to not have any more children into the fallopian tube. That caused so much issues internationally, but it was patient advocacy. It was patient groups that really moved the needle. And apparently in 2018, they took it off the market, finally.
Yeah.
So, again, the Margaret Meads of the world, we can make a stink if there's enough advocacy. The problem is how many people may get hurt in the process. So, waiting for that to happen. But people need to speak up, I think, for a lot of things, including medical device issues that they may be having or concerns or just doing their, routine, due diligence, right?
Right.
So let me ask you some other good questions. I hope they're good questions, actually. We talked about, oversight. We talked about devices. We talked about sort of this kind of concept of, being a smart consumer a little bit, but I wanted to go over some of the things that you might recommend. If you're someone who needs a pacemaker, you're someone who needs a defibrillator, you're someone who needs potentially an IUD, things that, really do make our lives often better, more convenient, prevent having children when we're not ready to have them or whatever. Just what are your thoughts on the top of your head as to how someone would go about, investigating that process and thinking about it?
It's pretty hard and frustrating. I mean, my first reaction is this shouldn't be on the shoulder of patients. It's too hard. It's hard enough for people who spend their lives like I do, trying to assess clinical data and figure out what really works and what doesn't. And I sort of want to take the other side now for a moment, just a brief moment, when you said you don't want this to be alarmist. And that's true. I mean, one of the problems when you talk to somebody like me is that, this is what I focus on. And the reality is what really drives me a lot is the not knowing that there are many excellent things that have happened in medicine, many astonishing things that you just can't believe that people have been able to do and come up with. But the other things are all getting a free ride based on the idea that, well, medicine's so amazing and so advanced. And yet there are these dismal failures. So I don't feel like it's my job when I write a book like that to reemphasize what industry does all the time. I mean, right now, if you look up a drug or a device and you plug it into Google, you will get page after page after page that is run by industry. You won't see the critiques. You won't see the groups that have talked about problems. You won't get Public Citizen's review or Cochrane's review that says this is bad. So they pretty much own the narrative. So I get frustrated with them owning the narrative, feeling like it's my job to, say, wait a minute. Now, how can a consumer, and yes, even getting together with other patients can be problematic. As you know, it's easy to ascribe, and I've done it myself. I had back pain for a long time. And first I thought, oh, it must be this. And then it was, oh, it must be that. And I ended up with surgery. Surgery didn't do a damn thing. And then I finally realized, I don't know that I'll ever know really what triggered it and what relieved it, because people get better and get worse on their own. And so how do you tell? I don't have a good answer for it. And just getting together with other patients on Reddit and things like that can really lead people astray. I think you have to have a trusted doctor, a doctor who is someone who you can't ask a doctor's time and every visit to ask for every study and what made a difference. And it's just not realistic in our current healthcare system. It's a disaster. When I was practicing and I left before it got even worse, I'd have literally 7 minutes per patient. It was just terrible. you can't serve them. You can't answer the questions. So patients getting the answers on their own and then turning to other patients. I've seen a lot of stuff on Reddit that I just cringe and say, just because you had this symptoms and you took that drug or you had that device, it doesn't mean that was causal. So there are, if you look in the back of the book, there are some websites that you can go to. I'd say Public Citizen, Cochrane. There are things like that where if you can get a review of a particular drug or device that you're interested in, that can help. But that would be far better than just patient groups. And yeah, eSure was a good thing. The women got together on that. But there are many, many more groups where I'd say the opposite was true. So
yeah. Thanks for sharing that, because that's an excellent answer. We want to have camaraderie. We want to have people that support us in what we assume to be cause and effect, but that may not always be the case and can lead us down a bad road. But researching where you can, looking where you can. These are a couple others listed that were at the end of the documentary, but I like some of them. Get second opinions for risky or expensive procedures. Yes. I mean,
Absolutely.
Where did second opinions come from? This came from the medical industry, right? Third opinions and fourth opinions. I mean, I think the more serious, the more invasive, or the more questionable, maybe it's a new procedure, a procedure, you might want to dig deeper and get more opinions. And what I tell patients is don't tell the next doctor that you go for an opinion what the last doctor said, because you really want a fresh opinion. You don't want someone sort of leaning on a previous opinion, in my opinion.
And
ask how many procedures that surgeon has done. Ask if this is new, if they're the first to the Da Vinci, apparatus versus being, 100, or 200 procedures in. These are the kinds of things you want to be thinking about. Have a friend or family member advocate while you're in the hospital. I can't stress that enough. Independent of everything we've talked about today, having an advocacy in the healthcare environment is kind of important, especially if you're going to be sedated, if you're going to be under, any type of medication that makes you not lucid. I think these are really important things to have an advocate who can speak for you and knows you well. You can ask a doctor if they've been paid by that medical device company, but they're often probably not going to reveal that.
Right.
But they have a website, openpaymentsdata.cms.gov. And you agree that's the website.
And dollars for docs, or you can look it up that way.
Dollars for docs. And then the Sunshine Act is something that I'm aware of in terms of just how much doctors get paid generally per year in terms of their the drug payments, the drug company payments. Even having lunches that are paid for by pharma gets calculated into the Sunshine Act. But we'll have some of those links in our page, in our episode.
Oh, you're a much better interviewee than I am. Thank you so much for getting that. Totally forgot.
Yeah. You know what? It's the thing is that as much as this is such an incredibly shocking and important conversation, I like to focus on the what to do. What are the solutions to this very messed up, situation in terms of oversight and regulation and required testing? What do we do with what we got? And
Well, one thing I respond, you gave a lot of good things for, individuals to do, but I would say that we really need political change. We need to change our system so that there truly are independent resources for us. And right now, the FDA has been bought, it's a captured agency. It's been bought and sold by pharma and medical device makers. And I think politically, we need to look at campaign finance reform, because what happens is that, like that Menaflex guy, CEO, the politicians get contacted by pharmaceutical lobbyists, and those politicians' war chests are filled with money from big pharma. Yeah. So what did the politician do that was from the state, New Jersey, where Menaflex was being made? They called and pressured the FDA and said, you've got to get this guy on the AdCom. We've got to get this device approved. And it's all about money and profit. And that's where we get a big problem, so that we land up with places like Canada and Europe not approving things that we are approving. And that's a bit of a reversal. It used to be that the FDA was it was the respected giant of the world in terms of drug regulation. Deservedly, it was really good decades ago, before they started stripping away all of its powers, because big pharma didn't want it to have the power to restrict and refuse to approve drugs and devices.
Excellent. This is such an important thing to be thinking about as you move forward. And I know we weren't going to really dive into this because it's not either one of our areas, but do we know anything about the aesthetic industry and whether or not there's any required testing for fillers and for things that we do?
I know the same filmmakers who did with The Bleeding Edge, they did a documentary, I believe, on cosmetics.
Yeah.
So
I'm going to look into that and see if I can draw some information from that because, my understanding, similar to how cosmetics and cleaning products, all the chemicals are really not required to have any testing. That was my big shocker 15 years ago. It's very interesting. And especially as I'm aging into my 50s and everyone's really running to do, we're all human, right? But we're looking to, people are doing a lot with these, injectables and chin replacements. And these are materials that, I don't know what category they're put into, but I want, at least from this conversation, to consider, doing due diligence on those procedures, no matter how tempting they may be. Jeanne Lenzer, what are you up to now? What are you doing in the future? What is your next project? I'm so excited to hear what work comes from your brain. So tell the audience.
So it's very simple. I'm trying to do the same thing with FDA on drugs that I did with FDA on devices.
Okay. So digging deeper.
And the picture is just as troubling.
To be continued. We will have to have you back on. But I'll tell you, I've just looked at an article from the British Medical Journal that you did. It's just really incredible work.
On the Alzheimer's drug?
Yeah. We can't get into it now, but I gotta be honest with you. Your work is remarkable and fearless. And we like fearless people on this podcast. So
thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. Thank you for being here. And if anyone needs to reach you, I'm sure they can find you, but we'll have all of certainly your bio and great resources on the page for this episode. So thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you so much, Ailey, for having me. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye.